The first time I worked with Eadweard Muybridge stuff was in 2011, and it was in relation to a piece that was set on the construction site of the Shenzhen Stock Exchange in China. And this photograph was taken from the house of one of the owners or one of the directors of the Central Pacific and the Southern Pacific Railroad Corporations, which were also, the Southern Pacific anyway, they were owned and operated by the same people, the Central and the Southern. But the Southern Pacific was the first to get the Supreme Court in the United States to rule that corporations could be considered persons under the 14th Amendment to the US Constitution, which basically just gave equal rights to all persons in the United States. And yeah, they basically brought a tax case all the way to the Supreme Court, refusing to pay their taxes in California under the pretext that they were a person as a corporation. And the Supreme Court eventually ruled that indeed they could be considered a person with equal protections as natural persons. And yeah, so there's that. This photograph was taken, let's say, from the, not really the headquarters of that corporation, but from one of its individual owners, one of its directors. And so, yeah, in a way, for me, one of the central questions behind this panorama is what are we seeing? What is it a picture of? Is this a picture of San Francisco in 1878? Is it a picture of the view that this one particularly wealthy individual had? Is it a picture of property, the property that makes up the city? Well, I think there's a lot of, I mean, it's not intentionally obscure or something like that, but let's say the central, well, okay, one of the main things that I wanted to kind of do with this panorama is reconnect it back to this moment in which it occurred, and what was really the kind of one of the largest stories of the day, which is also a story about, as I kind of mentioned before, a story of incorporation in a way, if you consider organized labor to be a form of incorporation, at least in the kind of broad sense that incorporation, like the coming together of many to form a single body and speak with that single body to be recognized by the law, but also, yeah, more generally in society. And so that was going on in the labor strike against the railroads in 1877. And in some ways, Muybridge had provided a detail through which that photograph could be connected to those events. I mean, there's many details in the photographs that relate to those events and how they kind of manifested themselves by the time, because it started in the east and it moved west. So by the time it got to San Francisco, the strike was in a, let's say it happened in a different form than it happened in the east. And it was kind of hijacked in San Francisco by this one particular character, Dennis Kearney, who kind of turned it into an anti-Chinese immigrant event, let's say, or mobilization. So these large meetings that happened right at the end of the strikes that were happening across the country in San Francisco started out as meetings about how to organize there, how to take into account the strike. And there were these kind of, there are stories within and these stories figure in this kind of detail section of the piece. So this table screen that where there are a number of sources that are laid out, which is kind of guided by this biography that Rebecca Solnit wrote on Muybridge, I think like maybe 2003 or something. Anyway, some time ago. And she has a very, I mean, in general, well, let's say her chapter on the panoramas are one of the best cases, I think, of reconnecting those panoramas to that social context in which they were taken. But there seems to be a general disconnect, even with histories of the labor movement in California. For example, there is this, one of the kind of key texts was written in '35, and there when they describe the effects of the chapter, which is kind of describing how the strike came to San Francisco,